Thomas Jockin!
Hey Daniel, good to
How
hear
are
from
you,
you.
my friend? So Zoom updated, and I've been freaked out ever since because the way it records things are now different. And I've had three calls now where I thought the recording had been lost, only to have it emailed to me later. I love updates. It's always fun, but I think I have figured it out now. How are you doing today, Mr. Jockin? You doing all right?
I'm good. I'm good. I am traveling today, so that's
I hope you're traveling somewhere you want to go, Mr. Jockin.
I do.
Good. What you been thinking about, Jockin?
Yeah, two notes. First of all, one, fall's a lovely time. I agree. I love the change of the leaves. It's always a lovely time. Um, but yeah, it's funny. I've been thinking a lot about the limits of attribution definitions. That's been a topic I'm really interested in lately, mainly because of the um, for example, like the property of a square, right? Basically, a lot of times a definition for a square, they'll give you a bunch of attributions, right angles, parallel lines, and then they show the conic square. So basically, if you take a square and present it in a conic mapping, then all of a sudden it obliterates all of our expectations of what would a square look like. And it's because you realize that attribution definition is reliant on unspoken propositions, postulates underneath, mainly like Euclid's fifth postulate, for example, um, that make a square a square. So that's pointing out is just that supposedly a definition by attribution is certainly not the substance of the thing. The parallel of human beings is basically to say, basically featherless biped, right? Versus, and even the normal example of this is Aristotle and Plato's point of like, as especially Aristotle, as opposed to the featherless biped. The usual example of a definition for man is rational animal or animal with possession of logos. Even then, I've been chewing on that because that's still a kind of attribution because possessions can come and go. Um, so that I'm just chewing on that point. I think it's a really interesting uh, problem of explaining what is the essence of things, especially when we seem to push on the point, everything that supposedly its definition points to an attribution, not a definition, not by the essence, expectation of what Plato and Aristotle are looking for, really. Um, and then top that off, and then just on another kind of parallel point is then the problem of when we do have these attributions, how much a lot of them are confounding. They interrelate with each other. So it's almost like when you try to manipulate one or try to understand one, you're actually affecting another one. The example I use a lot is, and I was giving a lecture on typography recently, and this is very particular on a particular point. So if we increase the font size by double and have it, so if we increase by double it and have it, if we when we do that, we're changing if you imagine like a lowercase n or an lowercase I, take your pick, as a rectilinear shape. When we're increasing or decreasing it, the size, we're also changing the width of that stroke of the rectangle, not just the height of it. So as a result, we're introducing weight. So there's what we call in the language typography a weight increase that's happening with the font size increase. So size and weight are getting changed, they're having at the same time. And if you try to control for it, uh, it's actually very difficult. And what ends up happening is it's not like you actually it's even when you do the optical adjustments to try to make it equal, when you double the size, decrease the size, it's actually not even exactly the same. There's a slight variation of a little bit wider the rectangle has to be when it's getting doubled and a little bit narrower, smaller uh, in width when you have it. So that's the point of like even when these confounding factors, even I just isolated two, weight and size, but even within that, uh, there's still adjustments that have to be made that show there are other confounding factors happening too. So just the problem of when we're trying to even understand attributions, that so many of these properties on actual entities are interrelated and interconnected. So it just makes it incredibly difficult to understand even what we're trying to get at when we're trying to understand these objects or properties or features.
Oh no, I think that's outstanding. And Philip and Dimitri, is wonderful to see you. And it's very interesting because there's also a few things come to mind. Who are attributes for? Who are descriptions for? Who are definitions for? Very often, a child can go up and play with a cup, and they don't need to understand the attributes or the definitions or stuff like that, right? So when we go into the business of trying to determine attributions, or like trying to just, because I'm kind of in my head thinking definitions of words, attributions, descriptions, like who are these for? Why do we as human beings come to a place where it seemingly seems to be there's a point in maturity where one seeks attributions, or what are the attributes or the essential characteristics versus the accidents, right? But it's very interesting. It almost necessarily has something to do with a kind of who to offer this to, how to communicate it to other people. Like the reason why I want to be able to talk about the attributes of a triangle is seemingly first to be able to communicate the thing to others beyond my experience of it. So then it's kind of and then it's also like in order to better guess when I'm encountering a triangle. And then also it's almost like I want to coordinate what I need to look for to find this thing. So for example, if I were to make an example of a sunflower, and I would just say, well, it's tall, it's yellow, and it faces the sun. Oh, okay. So if I want to find a sunflower, I need to go somewhere where it's sunny. I need to go somewhere where there's soil, and it's giving me a kind of coordination. It's also telling me what are the conditions that have to be met for this thing to come into existence if I want to create it, right? So it's interesting to think if discussing like terms and attributes have more to do with versus say definitions or getting at what a thing is. It's almost tied to things like coordination and situation and helping me know what I need to do to condition. Because at the end of the day, when you take all and then I'll give it to Philip here, when you put all the attributes together, there's these kind of confounding variables, and it's like, well, those don't go together. And yet it offers a useful approximation for what I need to do to find it, what I need to say for you to envision it if I'm writing a short story, or maybe I'm telling you there's this cool flower down at the store that you should go get because I know you like the color yellow. And it's also giving me an approximation of the conditions I need to meet in order to arise to it. And yet there's a kind of failure in it all at the same time. It makes me think a bit, Dimitri was talking about that Jasper's Heidegger conversation on Hitler, and Jasper's like, Heidegger, what the heck, man? Why do you like Hitler so much? And he's like, yeah, culture, Dimitri was saying, culture's nothing. But look at his hands. Man, look at those hands. How can you not go for those hands? You're like, what? And it's like the hands is an attribute. It's not just the hands. It's pointing towards something beyond it. But you need to coordinate your focus on Hitler at the hands to be best pointed at that thing, right? And the attribute of hand in having this failure actually gains a greater power. So there's something interesting about all that just comes to mind from the start. But let me give it to Philip and then Dimitri. Philip, it is good to see you, sir. I hope you are well.
You too, bro. Wonderful to see your vivacious visage. The attributes, I think, can have just that, what you just said, those qualities. I think they're currently being employed by the dominator class to limit imagination. I think just a little bit like phrenology. Like phrenology was a thing for a while where it was like, these attributes mean X, Y, Z. God, am I British? And the way that it's like kind of keeping people away from the ability to be reborn at the same rate at which technology is growing. I think a lot about Belonging Again, part 2.1. You talk about this triplex of economic sustainability, care, and like becoming, right? So I think what like is being sought for is some kind of attribute combo that's not on the menu. And it's playing with those things Jockin's talking about with the lengthening of this and the furthering of that, adding new dimensions, and finding perhaps more weight or more depth. And I wonder how you think about this as far as like maybe like Belonging Again part 37 2C will be something like a myth, right? Because I'm wondering how much these attributes are ingrained in myth versus scholarship. and how those two go together. And like, if the myth isn't strong enough, is that when scholarship comes in and is like, well, let me explain why the myth is bullshit, you know? And then the myth comes back and it's like, no, I'm actually saying something way, way different than the scientists or whatever. And if there's kind of like an oscillation between those two that allows for growth of attributes so that people can inhabit different ontological positions.
I think that's beautifully put, and that is the exact volume number. I'm amazed you hit it on the head so perfectly. I'll give it to Dimitri. Well, there's a few things. What's very interesting, because it's like also too notably, so I like what you're saying. There's attributes to constrain, like reducing it to these attributes, which then of course would align with maybe AI sort of control, ones and zeros. It's all just ones and zeros. These are the key essential attributes. That's then a kind of restrictive. And critically, interestingly, in treating attributes that way, there's something successful about it. Yes, we've got it, but that's precisely the problem. We've gotten to the essential, we've succeeded, but funny enough, that's when you've actually really deeply failed in the worst of all possible ways in a self-effacement versus a sublation. But that's also when you've lost the capacity to see that you failed, because you boiled everything down to a focus where you can't see the self-effacement that you're now entering into because of it. But attributes in the way that you're describing that have these attributes that lead to a certain failure is precisely the success, which is odd. But then that also necessarily makes an opening for some sort of human judgment or human involvement to identify that failure and what it entails, right? Like the example that comes to mind, I know we've talked about it before, but I really do like the book Surfaces and Essences by Hofstadter and Sanders on language. And when he says, he goes through all the language philosophies, and without going through the arguments, but I think it's extremely powerful, he says a tree is not really a definition, it's a halo. It's a kind of, due to analogous relationships, that it's a kind of halo that opens and you gather it. Okay, limbs, trees. No, it doesn't include a metal. Oh, but it does include some flowers on some trees. So it's like an expanding halo that closes. But here's the key. The halo is known by experience. Like that's the weird thing. Like you cannot for Hofstadter, and I think this also gets when Kimsky's at his best, also gets into that. And actually kind of gets into the later Wittgenstein too. When he looks at the early Wittgenstein, he's like, that guy was nuts. And so the later Wittgenstein, when after he's gone through the crucible of uncertainty, there's this idea where language is more like a halo that expands you, and then you're participating in something. That the funny thing is, a halo must fail being brought into a definition, but that's actually the success of being toward actuality. The failure then is actually the movement toward how the thing actually is, dang it. And Jockin has put, that's wonderful. And so, but here's the key. Not all attributes seem to not all attributes seem to equally bring you into the recognition of the halo. And it seems to be a skill of the philosopher or artist to make you notice what's the attribute that makes you see the halo. And I'm thinking of the Hitler's hands again. Like the genius of that answer, it's like, oh, you've been listening to his voice. You've been listening to his mighty, his political paralysis. No. That's not how you're going to get the halo, is by looking at his hands. That's the particular attribute that has a particular failure that then collapses the attempt to bring it into a clear definition that then enters into the halo. So there is something here where not all attributes, not all things you can focus on, equally make you realize that halo. And then, of course, why would you ever think hands, just based on Dimitri, like, why would you ever think hands is the one? That's what you need to look at. That's what's going to do it. And you could argue, I think many mythologies are basically the genius of knowing the particular thing to look at that shatters into a halo, right? But then when you get the science, some of the kind, well, we want the empirical knowledge, right? We want to understand the thing fully. I was speaking, that's then killing the halo. But then if you kill the halo, you also lose the capacity to see the halo and to know you lost the halo. So you lose the capacity to know you lost something. So you're damned precisely because you don't know you're damned. So those are the stakes too, right? Like if you close yourself off into a thing, then the thing, it's like the Hamlet idea, right? Like the universe in a walnut or something, right? Like the C.S. Lewis, right? Like if you stuff everything into a definition, you then lose the capacity to see what's beyond it, and thus you didn't lose anything because you have all there is. And that's the real tragedy of damnation, is you lose the capacity to know that you're damned, per se. But it's very interesting that not all attributes and ways of seeing things seem to equally make you realize this halo. And it seems to be a role of the artist and the philosopher when they're at their best. They have some sort of skill of knowing what's the attribute you need to see to shatter into this halo effect. But let me give it to Dimitri. Dimitri, it is good to see you. Wonderful job at the conference, sir. It's a pleasure to have you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. I've actually, since I've done that presentation, a few days later, I actually realized what my own point was. But it's indeed about the seemingly contingent particularity, right? Because Karl Jaspers was basically asking, Heidegger, tell me the logic that has led up to this point where Hitler is ruling Germany. Like, how do we make sense of this, right? Because it seems senseless. But then Heidegger gave a seemingly senseless answer. But that's where the genius is actually located. Why? Well, I'll go into this. It's a very interesting conversation, and I'm glad you brought up judgment, because this is what I want to bring in. So if we get rid of the word definition, like you seem to want to do, we can maybe change this to the word axiom, first principle, or maybe declaration. Maybe declaration. Well, a declaration is not really, doesn't really make sense to us unless we go into the explanation. But that explanation doesn't really make sense to us if you cannot make a judgment based on that explanation, right? But then this moment of judgment itself seems to be opposed to that very declaration and explanation, because you just gave me two abstract formulas, you know, a declaration and an explanation. But then suddenly you give me a particular example. In other words, a judgment, right? Like here it applies. So how do we, what's that opposition, right? Like, are we just gonna, is this all we get? Like, we're just gonna have explanations which do not seem adequate to judgments, and judgment which seem to, you know, undermine explanations and declarations? Well, I think here the word that kind of like seals them together, to me, would be conclusion. The moment we can go through the declaration, the explanation, make a judgment out of it, and that this process itself lets us on to a conclusion. Now, what I think is that this process of mediation itself, or the immediate mediation of a conclusion, you know, the conclusion is like basically the dot at the end of a sentence, right? That's like the end of the process. The funny thing is that this conclusion itself could also be seen as the declaration of whatever is going to come from it. So here I want to bring in Hegel's idea of the free will and the idea of free spirit, which is such a wonderful word. Of course, how can you be against free-spiritedness? Well, Hegel is in his encyclopedia, he says, yeah, it's wonderful once we've actually attained this freedom that's not only in itself, but also has been made conscious for itself. But as soon as we take freedom for itself, Hegel says, well, it's also tremendously dangerous and volatile. In other words, you could see communism and the communist experiment as an experiment that was very aware of the essence of human beings being freedom for itself, right? Like liberate human labor from its oppression, so we can truly go for our like creative labor and the the expressions we get from that. But so the funny thing is that once we get to the conclusion, this conclusion itself, I think maybe it would be more accurate to say this, that the conclusion would not be a conclusion if it stays as its own declaration. This conclusion itself, the truth of this conclusion, paradoxically, you can only see in how this conclusion then allows you to further differentiate and let's say expand the different facets and attributes of the halo. Now, also these differentiations, or like this blossoming of the concept, which you get from one like kernel in a way, these must come to a conclusion, their process, because they only find their conclusion in their process, not in the opposition of the universal and the particular. That would be for Hegel being stuck in the mode of the understanding, which opposes a universality onto the particular, and this imposing or this superimposing. Like what do we do when we're in this mode of thinking where we try to reflect upon the universal and we try to make it coherent with the particular, to have one like narrative encapsulating everything? Once this fails, the problem is that this very opposition to the particular might be seen as our universal not being enforced heavily enough. So in other words, whenever my understanding fails, I just have to push it harder onto whoever's not understanding this, right? Like, and take the Enlightenment itself. Like Richard Dawkins had this debate with Ayanirsi Ali, and she was saying, well, Richard Dawkins, your atheism, even if we say it's correct, do young people are they going, is this going to be good for society when everything becomes atheistic, because it seems to be kind of nihilistic? And Richard Dawkins just said, well, actually there's lots of moral atheistic theories we can get into, and if people want to know about it, they just have to learn it, and if they are not doing it, we just have to make it so that they do. So that's the eerie violence that can stem from the declaration and explanation opposed to the judgment. Or so yeah, it's I think so important to be able to conclude processes in philosophy, and it's kind of traumatic in a way, right? Because if I just look back on my own philosophizing, I take these concepts like the spirit child or love or Hegelian tantra or freedom, and I'm like, this is in some way the absolute. I really want to dive into it, but when I come to a conclusion in this process, maybe when I finish writing the paper and I feel like I've kind of that I've kind of exhausted it, I have to move on from it. I have to move on from it, because if I stay with it, it will actually regress to this, opposing of universality and particularity. So yeah, Daniel, I really agree with you. It's like you gotta, and that's the contingency of it. There's you gotta have a tact in being able to make that leap of faith, making that jump, and also, I don't know, maybe it's even intuition to know, like, okay, what's the next jump from this concluding, right? Because that's the funny thing when reading Hegel. It's like, when I say, for Hegel, right is the existence of freedom, everyone could come to me and be like, oh, well, what the fuck do you mean by this? But when you read his text, and then once you get to right, it's like, of course, right is the existence of freedom. But it comes to you as contingent, but by thinking through the process, it is a contingency that has turned into a necessity. And so to me, I've been thinking a lot, that's the last thing I'll say, about the dialectics of contingency and necessity and contingency, which is really wild, and we shouldn't taper over that too quickly, because it's really, I think Hegel says in a few places that it's one of the hardest dialectics to think. In the Science of Logic, it's located at the very end of the essence section, which means that in the dialectics of contingency and necessity lies the becoming of, or the genesis of the becoming of the concept, which is a moment of self-consciousness, right? So it's really mind-blowing, and I'm kind of obsessing about this right now. So it's a great conversation as always.
No, this is outstanding. So a bunch of things come to mind. I'll give it to Philip and Steve. Always good to see you. And actually, what's very interesting, because I'm now thinking about athletics and arts and different things like that, because so what's the difference between the conclusion, where you finish a paper and say, oh, I get it. I get the conclusion, you put it away, versus when you conclude a great work of art and you go, oh my gosh, like the conclusion forces something upon you. Like, you must change your life, as the Rilke poem goes, right? Or like when you suddenly get like that moment in athleticism or boxing or something where you go, wow, I didn't know this kind of world was possible. And then you give yourself over to it, right? No, what's the difference between the conclusion, where you're done with, and the conclusion of you must now make a choice. Like you must change your life. Also, too, once you experience great art, it's an interesting thing because you can no longer tell yourself that this kind of thing doesn't exist. So in that grace, there's also a kind of slamming the door shut, right? Like, it's one of the reasons why people don't want to do things and try their freedom, because if you find out you can, then you're responsible if you don't. And that's where I think contingency and necessity also come together. Exactly. Where they come together. Because in freedom, because it's the example I always give from the end of the Nabokov, where he talks about one of those pictures that's made of all those little pictures. And once you find the right distance, suddenly you see the big picture, the sailor, like find the sailor. Now you can't unsee it. Before you couldn't see it, you had no idea, but you were free to walk around until you found it. And then when you saw it, bam, you can't unsee it. It moves into necessity, right? So it seems to go with the most important things in life. Like once you see what you're capable of, once you see what this world can offer, once you see that you're not as good of a writer as you thought, once you see that you could actually take yourself to the next level, then the question is, do you? So but here's the funny thing. Once you discover what great art is, or great athleticism, or et cetera, so forth, and now you can't unsee it, there's a freedom because now you know there's a possibility. There's a possibility of you writing like Faulkner or something, right? You may have no idea how. You may have no freaking clue. But in that opening of the possibility, there's a necessity of you now having to know this is possible and knowing if you rise to its occasion or not. But in that is the grace of possibly then having something for your life, drive, right? Intrinsic motivation, things like that, right? And but here's what's also very interesting, because I think so there's this conclusion that is like, bam, because it is like, there's such a difference when you conclude, and I'll give it to, when you conclude a great book or a great story or good work, what do you say? I've got to watch that again. I've got to read that again. Isn't that like a true infinity? Isn't that funny? Versus when you conclude something, when you go, okay, next paper, that's a spurious infinity, right? So at the moment of the conclusion, I think the conclusion that Hegel has put, this important conclusion, is what you see in art, is what you see in great moments of life, athleticism's beauty. And it is interesting because it is a conclusion that brings with it a certain, I gotta redo this, but it's tied to a particularity. Like when you finish a great novel, excellent, yeah. Like when you finish a great novel, there's a sense of, I want to read it again, almost because I want to redo the experience, right? Or I want to catch the things I missed. Well, how do you miss something that you read? Like you read the words. What do you mean you missed it? You needed the conclusion to see the double entendres and all the other things that were going on, right? So the conclusion changes the always already of what was before, and the conclusion has some sort of powerful effect of making you intuit that there was more there. So this is where intuition seems really weird, because it seems to come at like, how do you know when you can, like, where does that feeling come from? Of us, I must change my life, I must do some great, what do you intuit that this is what you need to do? Well, this seems to be non-rational, beyond the rational, and yet is only possible because of the rational, in the failure of it, that opens up this sort of, and now you must change your life. And I would argue, I'll give it to Philip and then Dimitri. In my opinion, this is politically consequential, because if we want to kind of like, if we take the conclusion as the point of, you must take a leap of faith, okay? Like you must take a leap. If human beings do not do this, they're going to leap for someone, like a Hitler. Like we all have, like the meaning crisis is the lack of leap crisis in a sense, right? So your hunger for this, and if you see that you're going to leap for someone or you're going to take a leap of faith, it seems like it's one or the other. We either take leaps of faith or we're going to end up leaping for someone. Because as Burke talks about, the sublime is that we all have this sublime hunger, which is tied, like the sublime and the beauty kind of makes this dialectic. If we do not figure out a way to kind of, well, it gets into the return of the repression as well, right? Because you're looking for that thing to give yourself over to. So you're going to jump for. So it's either a leap of faith or you're going to jump for something. Because that, it's like sixth sense, if you will, of finding that attribute that opens everything up. You're going to locate it in Hitler's hands, or you're going to locate it in the poem that says you must change your life, right? So this is extremely consequential. So I think there are political stakes as well. More could be said, but let me give it to Philip and then Dimitri. Philip, please.
There's something about like the will to boundlessness I really like. I think Hegel uses in that section the term Begriff, which can also in German mean an expression. The idea being that we're on this eternal recurrence of becoming who we are. And each time like we go on that thing, it's like, yes, that is, but also there's more. There's like, but in order to get to the boundlessness, I have to take on these constraints because my last leap, I got, 30 meters high. But if I go and do, eat my Wheaties and whatnot, like I could Super Mario jump to the sky. And all of a sudden, because of that change in perspective due to an enlargement of my life force, I am going to know different things. And I think that this is one of the compulsions that gets caught in short circuits in the commodity form, in certain relationship habits, in family dynamics, et cetera, so forth, where it goes from the move from the particular to the singular through some kind of abyssal mediation of essence that allows you to once again begin again and be like kind of curious about this will to boundlessness and be like, maybe if I apply enough rigor, like the rigor of an Aleister Crowley, I can see that this world is sort of bound by love. And we're all these individuals that if I can just love each one all the time, keep turning that dial up, maybe there is no other force that could bring us together. And then you scream at the barista because they put oat instead of soy milk in. You go, whoa, what's that about? Like, for a second there, I thought I loved everyone, and like, then I got to pay my taxes and I'm upset. So how to kind of get to that point? I think he would call it absolute knowing, right? Of becoming conscious of your compulsion to boundlessness. And on some level, like steering your life so you're getting rid of certain boundlessness options that you're not that are not nutritious, sort of like in search of lost time. So you feel the tug and you're like, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to go for this type of expression of myself. And it just seems like the upper limits of human potential are actually unknown. Like we think, but then there was like this lady that did the Appalachian Trail in like half the time. Did you see this? That was insane. She was just like, yeah, I don't know. Kind of, it's like, can you just try your best at everything you do? I mean, it sometimes comes down to like simple things like this. But yeah, this lady supposedly like was just like, yeah, I just wanted to go 13 or 14 hours every single day. And people are like, that's crazy. You can't do that. She's like, well, I'll give it a shot. Let's see what happens. But yeah, that leap, I think, is super interesting. And what happens if it, leads to insight? What happens if you get right next to madness and then you got to come back and you got to jump again? How many times do you have to jump? I think one of the lamest things to buy into is that there's going to be like some kind of big rest in this life. Like this retirement ethos, like, oh, if I just gas for 30, 40 years, then I'll be like, I'm on a beach and not thinking about anything. It's, I think more like we're looking to be more and more an expression of boundlessness as we're physically marching towards the grave, and kind of then trying with this belonging again of communicating through myth to the next generation. Hey, you guys got a little more physical power. Do this, and this, and don't do this, and this. And we'll call that a good life.
Magnificent. I'll give it to you. So a few things come to mind. First off, If you are watching this Appalachian lady who did what you did, you're really amazing. Well done. Because that is crazy. So, you know, there's a few that, there's a difference between doing the hard work of having a particular thing in front of you be boundless, as opposed to thinking about reality as boundless. Because that second one gets us into a lot of trouble. There's a wonderful section in the Brothers Karamazov where the guy comes up to Father Zosima and he says, Father, forgive me, for I have sinned, because I came to love humanity at the expense of an individual. And I think very often the world finds itself difficult to love individuals and very easy to love humanity. And what Dostoevsky is suggesting is that the love of humanity ends up being a very destructive force, because ultimately the guy, and it goes all throughout the story, it's like all these characters who loved ideas and so came to hate the thing that the idea was about. Because there is something about human beings that really struggle in that way. And actually the difference between boundless in and boundless from seems to be captured in that. We all have, like you're saying, this will to boundlessness, this kind of drive for the boundlessness. The question is, are we going to pour it into something? The absolute choice, I say, I'm going to commit to writing. Well, here's the thing about that. I'll make this example because we've been editing Under the Wing to get it ready and all these 15 years. And so a story we've been doing that is going to make me, you said bordering madness? Yes. A story that is making me border madness, or is every one of them, but we've been doing a story called Esperanza. So the funny thing about Esperanza is this is like, just to speak. What's very funny is I thought it was completely done 8 times, like done. And then it finds out, no, it wasn't done at all, actually. That you found that this thing was boundless because you keep coming back to it. If you have a commitment to this particular story that you keep working on, you find out, oh my gosh, I thought this was done, but this is terrible. This is terrible. You're blown away, like literally 15 years. You're like, how is it that I thought this was done like so many times? And it wasn't. The revelation of the boundlessness of a particular thing comes out in the commitment to it that actually is experienced as a kind of horror, usually, because it shows that the story's not as good as you thought. Oh, you thought you were a good wrestler? No. Oh, you thought you were really good at doing Granbys? No. It turns out when you go to the state championship, not so much, right? So then, in response to the horror of the boundlessness of realizing you need to pour in a bunch more. Oh, and by the way, if you get a single word wrong in this sentence, this ballet dance doesn't work and you're an idiot. Those are the stakes. I think I'd rather love literature versus a particular story. Literature sounds great because literature is not this, it's boundless. There's always more writers to read, more stories to talk about, being a critic, because there's a loving humanity. But when you go like a particular story that you're revising over and over again and realizing, I really thought I was good at this and I'm not. For 15 years, time and time again, that's the kind of boundlessness that the human will, Mr. Rivera, good to see you, the will for boundlessness needs to be poured into a particular thing. And the boundlessness is usually experienced as a failure. Oh, you thought, but then that is the only condition where seemingly beauty can come in. Because when you get it right, and this is where this is the magical moment, like the intuition, it comes to you, you say, yes, that's right, oh my gosh. And it has a power that is possible only from that boundlessness. And the issue is that kind of boundlessness requires a commitment to a particular thing over a long term. And if we do not do that, then it's free floating and it's probably going to be captured by a political force or be directed towards something. And that's when we get in all sorts of effing trouble, right? And so there's also too, like in that, it's the boundlessness of a thing, because it's also like, you can only have this, it's not merely the mindless repetition of seeing the same mailbox every day. You could say, well, you saw the same mailbox every day, right? No, it has to be something you care about. You have to really care about it. You have to, that's where the absolute choice is not merely the repetition of something in the background, per se. Like, what's the difference between seeing the same mailbox every day and working on the same story over 15 years? Care, relationship, and commitment, and sweat and blood, right? Pouring, right? That's the difference. But the only way to experience boundlessness is some sort of, it almost has to be that your best efforts came up short. That's the only way the boundlessness in a particular thing can be experienced, as your best efforts came up short. But that actually means you can do better. Oh, if it came up short, there's more to do. So I can get better. I can work hard. There's actually, wow, because then then you realize that sentences can be a lot more beautiful than you thought. Stories can be a lot more better than you thought. Athletics can be a lot more better than you thought. So that failure means the world isn't as limited as you thought, or wasn't as finished as you thought. But the reason you stopped on revision 8 is because you thought it was done. So you thought it was over. You had to saturate to that point, per se, to be able to genuinely encounter the shock that the thing isn't done and it's not as good as you thought, which is simultaneously the realization that the world is bigger than you thought, that there's more that can be tried, there's more that can be realized, and things can come forth at different and higher and more powerful qualities. That's where the will to boundlessness needs to be directed. And I think this problem, this is when people talk nihilism, the meaning crisis, I think this is mostly what they're talking about. And it has to be tied, though, to a blood and sweat commitment to a particular person, art, task that you're willing to always come back and look at and let it strike you as not being as good as it thought, which is really hard, but also means that there's more to be done and you can move into drive, right? And then funny enough, if we think Lacan for a moment, that is, you know how there's this return to the constraint, Cadell has been talking about this, like the neurotic, right? That is the constraint on yourself that emerges from the commitment. You always have to do the very best that you possibly could, which then must seem like you're finished. That puts a constraint on your possibility to see what you need to go through the next 20 years to be able to see. So you're also using the will to the boundless to end the absolute choice and commitment to a particular thing that makes this possibility of drive occur, dealing with the need for some sort of constraint, but it's a limit for you. So then the free-floating spirit is then not, it's a terrible thing, but this terror is for the sake of the self-sacrifice for this experience of the ever unfolding of the thing that you are committed to. And so, but that's hard. But all the most important things are. But let me give it to Dimitri. Dimitri, please.
Yeah, wonderfully described, Daniel. That makes me think about the Divine Comedy of Dante and how he works on this for decades, right? Or Faust for decades. Or even like, because I think for these type of figures like Faust, not Faust, but like Goethe, Hegel, or even contemporary figures like Zizek, or even amongst yourself like you, Daniel. Like this is like, even when you're turning your life into this project, right? Like, is this like self-emptying into the project on all these different, I don't know how you say it in English, but in Dutch we call it like arcs of tension. Like there's small things you work on, but then there's also like decade-long projects you work on, and working with different art forms, right? Literature, but also philosophy, and then also like economics and politics. And that's really, I think that to me, about this will to boundlessness, I think this is on the level of desire. Like I want this boundlessness, but then the trick is to turn it into this boundless will. But the thing with this boundless will, and I think Daniel, you described it wonderfully. I think the function of the object A is different in the will to boundlessness and then the boundless will. In the will to boundlessness, the opposition you get from reaching that very thing, the boundlessness, is seen as an unovercomable obstacle, which somehow you have to keep striving. You have to keep striving to maybe eventually get to it. But then the boundless will is able to see that obstacle, that that object that's frustrating, or that hiccup, that glitch, as actually a feature of its boundlessness, not as an inhibition to its boundlessness. So that, I think that's how I would put this difference between the will to boundlessness and then the boundless will. And because you mentioned sublimity, I think there is, I've been reading Alenka Zupancic on comedy, and for her the sublime is still on the level of the tragic, whereas the comical is on the level of concrete universality, right? So there is a way that, like I said, we have this sublime hunger for tragedy, which there's a beauty to us in suffering, and or in other words, to put it more nicely, like there's a beauty to the will to boundlessness and its impossibility. But this beauty is really well, for one, it could be very banal for those who are not within that same like confinement of the will to boundlessness. And on the other hand, it itself is like this just this drive towards self-destruction, not like drive in technical sense, but like it's headed towards this kind of self-destruction because that's what it seeks, right? It will, because that will, that moment, that will to boundlessness gets this boundlessness, it is not the will to boundlessness anymore. So what is it? Well, it's something else. And then maybe it could be the boundless will, but that's where it starts to turn comical, because you don't get rid of the transcendent, beautiful, inexplicable absolute that drives you, but somehow you can actually see the transcendence in the banality, and you can, like, okay, I will put it like this. Comedy is so important here philosophically, because usually the theories of comedies are as follows. Comedy is kind of relativizing things. Comedy is showing us how the transcendent is actually always finite. For Hegel and Alenka Zupancic, it's totally different. It's that what comedy does is that by like taking the transcendent and like forcing it down into particularity, into its finite character, it still retains its transcendence. And I think that video, The Intellectual Dick Web, is a good example of this, because you had all these characters being completely ridiculous and completely self-undermining, but still each time they would just go on speaking as if they wouldn't be self-undermined, even though it was blatantly obvious that they were. So you get the self-undermining, but you still get the character asserting itself as absolutely consistent and self-identical and unscathed, so to say, by its going down. So that's what I mean to say by the unity of the particularity and the universality, or of transcendence, and it's coming down. So it's the hiccup in this way is starts turning into laughter, right? And laughter is kind of a weird hiccup. It's like this continuous hiccup of the breath, right? It's very awkward in that sense if it's too obscene to you, the joke or something like this. But one more thing, and I have to go. I'm quite tired. This philosophy, Daniel, that like we're talking about here, and the fact that we are in a point of history that this philosophy is emerging, is so hugely dangerous. Because let's take, what you said or what I said, and whatever person's gonna come to us, and they would hear our stories, like they would be in a certain singular context that they are living through, right? And we are basically saying to them, go to its conclusion and then make the leap. But wherever they are, that could mean wildly different things, right? And I mean, for me, it went into like Hegelian tantra. That's my first paper, and there was a huge danger to like exploring my sexuality like that. I did go through it, and it did help me. But I just really want to say that the beautiful freedom of this type of comprehension is also so dangerous. And I think then again, well, what are the limits of this freedom? And this is what I said in the presentation. Well, 80 years ago, it turned out to be Hitler's hands. That was the limit of the freedom that was attained in spirit in like the German Empire in Hegel's language, or the German realm. Most likely we're going to see on the personal level or on a civilizational level probably headed to something similar, a crazy contingency, inexplicable, just showing up in our faces, that is going to show us the limits of our freedom civilizationally. But also on the level of the personal, this is going to happen, right? But then I think, yeah, I'm definitely pro like thinking about plurality and these type of things. But the object A is, for Lacan, in itself just confusion. That's the first explanation of the object A. What is it? Just tell me what it is. It's confusion. That's what it is. in another way to explain it, in regarding the voice, the object A is the bone in our throat, which makes us mute whenever we come up against like the noumena in phenomena or trauma, basically. So this is the way that we actually come to face our freedom by its limitation in this object, which is our own, because no matter what kind of people I'm talking to, the plurality of different singularities, this object is going to show up for my singularity, is going to tell me everything about myself, not about these other people, right? This bone in the throat that makes me unable to know what I have to say back, how to respond, right? And not abreact, because that's what we all would prefer to do, just act on our impulses, get it out of my face, right? But then can we like retract, like think and then respond? It sounds simple in this way, but yeah, I think there's so many different facets of this. Yeah.
No, magnificent. Everything you said was wonderful, Christian. It's outstanding to see you. It's incredibly dangerous. The issue is that when we enter into a global economy, when we have globalization, global capital, global networks, and all of these different things, that precisely creates the condition of the danger. That then what you need to handle it is that middle. We were talking about the concert, at the conference with Bertrand de Juvenel, with the community, the churches, the social capital, the Lions Club, the middle. So you have the low is the individual. The middle is the social, you could say, social capital, social institutions. And the upper is like the government, the corporations, and different things, right? So his whole idea of the history of power is that the middle genuinely restricted individual freedom. The church said there were things you could and could not do. You had certain identifications. And the upper, what he says is the high teamed up with the low against the middle. And it was a genuine ethical increase because many people were restricted by the middle. But here's the problem. The middle, the middle also kept the top from being totalized power, because the king had to negotiate with the feudal lords or the curators or the preachers. His big point is that the divine right of kings is overstated. Kings were not nearly as powerful as people think. They were constantly having to negotiate with the feudal lords. But then the kings were able to say, these feudal lords treat y'all like crap. And the people went, you're right. So they turned up against the feudal lords, but the problem is that made the upper extremely powerful. And then the upper had to, then they could do what? Military conscription. They could use philosophical ideas like freedom and justice to bound people together, whereas before I could only convince people to join my army if it gave them more food, if it gave them shelter, if it directly impacted them. I was able to use notions, and I was able to use force and law to make bigger armies, right? And then what ended up happening is Bertrand says, if one nation did this, every other nation had to do it, or that army would destroy them. You had a multipolar trap. And then the same applies to capitalism. If you're open to global markets, but another nation isn't, it becomes isolationist. So everything erupts into a very large system. The capital nation state, obviously, for Nick Land, the logical end of this is, the AI dark enlightenment thing, right? All of that. So there's an incredible danger there that I think we've taken the myth of deterrence to convince us is not a big threat. And that myth is collapsing now because what is deterrence for one decade turns out to be escalation in the next, right? So you have this incredible dire danger going on, and Hamilrick made that point, extreme danger. So then there's only one way, really, looking at Bertrand, and if you grant me this, Livingston, Conyers, many historians say, well, you had to bring back the middle. Wait, wasn't the middle the thing that, caused all the oppression and xenophobia and racism and restricted people? Yeah, it was. Okay, so we have to bring back the middle, because here's why. It seems like this kind of consciousness that is able to have will to boundlessness versus boundless will seems to be the kind of mode of subjectivity that is needed, right? If you don't have a middle, you can't train it. You don't have coaches, you don't have mentors, you can't have families, you can't direct it, right? So the only way to be able to train this is to bring back the middle, but the middle has always been a source of the unethical in society, right? How do you have an ethical middle that also has the training to be able to guide people through yes, exactly, concrete universe, to guide people through this kind of subjectivity so that this incredibly dangerous mode of seeing reality does not lead to a psychosis that people cannot handle and leads to self-effacement and all of those problems, right? Because that's the rub. And this is where things like the liminal web and these communities, voicecraft, online spaces, I think are a new social coordination mechanism that if they are working with live places, this is the first time in history we've had the technology for a social coordination system that is not bound to geography. Most coordinations or social capital concentrations were colleges or like Washington, D.C. or cities, right? And that's all you could do. Those have always been the main, well, following Randall Collins, social capital tends to be near a university, but in a place outside the bureaucracy. So let's take the Bloomsbury group, right? That's only possible because of Cambridge or Oxford, right? But then they meet at a house with the wolves away from it. So the college brings them together, but then they meet nearby so that they're not bound by their bureaucracy. This seems to make history, okay? Like if we take the network effects of history and so on and so forth, the social capital networks, right? But this was always favoring basically people who could go to college, who had the connections, who had the wealth, or who were able to get that, right? It is never this unleashing of the network effect, if you want, I know I'm using network effect loosely there. The unleashing and making democratic the network effect has never occurred because the technology was not there, right? Because you need a social coordination mechanism to help people find the people they need to work through this dangerous, boundless will, or else they're going to destroy themselves. And if it is bound to universities or colleges or geography, it's not efficient enough. It cannot be democratized, right? So you have to have that unleashing, or else it is very probable the more you, and I'll give it to you, the more you introduce people to the boundless, it's not going to be the boundless will, it's going to be the will to the boundless. That is then going to, without a middle, have to either be directed toward, being overwhelmed, destroyed psychologically, or you're going to put it in Hitler's hands. Because that's the other thing Juvenal says. If you have this boundless will, it's going to, the upper, without the middle, the sublime, the will to boundlessness, this desire for power that Juvenal locates in the psychology, is going to move from the low to the high. And then you have a totalized, ultra powerful, and the people are completely disabled, as Ivan Illich says. They have no ways to connect. And when that happens, he says, then it's Philip Reeve, fascism is coming, uprisings are coming, people are going to get really upset and then want to burn it all down. Yeah, that's what happens. And so this is the stakes. But basically, I would also say, if we want to do the leap of faith in the way that we are describing, that I would associate with the boundless will. If we do not do that, we're going to leap for some leader or some movement or something, which will be the will to boundlessness. And then that ultimately will just be Lovecraft versus the love of Beatrice. But Dimitri, please.
Yeah, that's a really nice way to tie our presentations together, I think. Another way that you could think about this middle is that so when you get to the ethical system in the philosophy of right, you get three moments, which are the family, and then the community, or like the bourgeois community, and then the state, right? So for Hegel, the bourgeois community was the middle. Right, and like Goethe and Schiller were actually seen as, these are people like supplementing the German middle class with art. Like if you were a bourgeois in Germany, of course you had tons of books by Goethe, and you went to theater with your friends, and you went to listen to classical music. But then, there's the first early 20th century. In the Netherlands, we had this prime minister who was extremely successful and had tons of interesting projects. But anyhow, at the end of his life, he said that he failed to set up labor as a strong counterforce against capital, right? So we kind of had, in a way, capital as a middle, right, to mediate between the aristocracy and then the low. I know I'm taking a different view, because I'm not saying it's individuals on the low, but it's just another way to take the same model and think it through. But then, so you get a middle, which is the freedom of commerce, capitalism, all these beautiful things, industrialization. Also in our country, and this was how the 20th century was defined, right? Labor versus capital. Of course, the emancipatory of revolutionary labor was immediately co-opted by another kind of perverted managerial class, and the Stalinism and stuff like this. It does seem like we're still in this, in a way, labor versus capital. But indeed, like you're saying, with the internet, we get something that's radically different regarding universality and differentiation, and the singularities coming together. And what's interesting about the internet is that it's anglophonic, in the sense that like if you take France or Italy or Germany, lesser for Germany, but for France and Italy, this is very much the case. Because these are huge countries, the internet there is very much French or very much Italian. Whereas for small countries like in the Netherlands, it's way more Anglophonic. So there's also this element to it, right? Like there is like, do you have access to these philosophical internet communities if you're like Italian? Well, probably lesser so because you're lesser inclined to go into it. Of course, I know there's Italians in this community too, but I guess I'm just saying that this is like historically we are in the American empire, so to say, but it's the American cyber empire. But that's still the location, I guess, of freedom and also the differentiation of freedom. You know, I'm not arguing against it, but it's an interesting dynamic, right? Because it also gets into the geopolitics and can we comprehend our enemy? You know, like what about the Russian internet or the Chinese internet? You know, stuff like this. So with that said, I have to leave. It's late here, and
Well,
thank
you
you
are
so much.
beautiful, Dimitri. Those are excellent points. And again, though there are, to talk about the social coordination system is not necessarily to say all the kinks are out. There's the possibility of the technology for the coordination of social capital in ways that were not before possible. And there's also big differences between a podcast ecosystem, content creation, and social coordination, or bringing people together for certain sort of abilities to gain the kind of consciousness that can see the attributes, as Jockin was saying, that makes beauty come forth, or that makes you actually come to terms with your own, your concrete universality, that would also help you love an individual without it being at the expense of, to love an individual instead of loving humanity at the expense of individuals, as Mr. Ivan Illich said. Good to see you, Dimitri. And no, so the social coordination system, I think is very powerful. And I should have noted as well with Juvenel, and then I'll give it to Christian here. One of the key ways that he says that the high became total power is turning the low against the markets. Because you have the market and the business people in the middle, and he's like, these people are corrupt and they're evil. And so a lot of it is indeed a certain, like the market actually kind of like actually increased people's freedom. But then because they're not perfect and they are corrupt and they probably have more money than you, it was quite easy for the high to convince the low to turn on the market. But then if you do that, what ends up happening is market power just goes to the state, and you end up like what you do now, basically, the businesses that survive are the ones that are able to transition from the middle to the high, be a lobbyist on K Street or their Jekyll, whatever banking system they want to do. So then what ends up happening is actually the war on the middle just destroys all the small businesses. And then of course, the friggin' high loves it because it looks like they're fighting the market to help the people, when in fact they're fighting, the only market that gets fought are the ones that aren't too big to fail, right? Like the war of the high and the low against the middle, the too big to fail corporations, businesses, they love it because it just destroys their competition and it's not going to take them out, right? So it is very interesting to situate the economic question in that juvenile structure that I think has to take K Street or Mars Olson's book very, very seriously. And I think also there's something, I think there is like these questions, like I do look and follow kind of I think Urbit has kind of failed, but these decentralized, well, I don't know that for sure, I should be careful. These various ideas of decentralized internet, not merely decentralized currencies, there are questions there that have to be looked at. Anthony Morley's work that we've talked about on the coordination of intrinsic value, I think those things all arise. But definitely, the question is, how do we have a middle that helps people have a boundless will to take a leap of faith for a particular something versus fall into the mistake of loving humanity at the expense of individuals, the will to the boundless. These are all matters of bringing back a middle, but problematically, this is a great challenge because historically speaking, the middle has often oppressed people. But let me give it to Christian here. And Christian, it is good to see you, sir. Oh, he's outside. You're in the place.
Yeah, I'm out here. There's this old skit, I think it was Mr. Show, where Charles Manson escapes prison and he gets outside and he's just bewildered. He's like, I'm outside. just I don't know why that always stuck with me. The bewilderment of being outside is an interesting idea. So I'm trying to take this concept of the low, the high, and the middle, and understand things I'm thinking about right now in that framework. And it seems like you can, I mean, it's such a basic concept that you can apply it. It's so many levels of scale and from different perspectives, and you could think about it, yeah, almost endlessly. But to try to keep on track a little bit with what's been said, one question I'm thinking about, because I'm thinking I'll probably do some political activism in this regard, is trying to create more of a interstitial governance layer at the level of local and state politics here in Arizona. And it's like, all right, well, how do you do that? And there's an interesting intersection here between the middle of the high and the low, and the middle of the left and the right. And it's something I've been trying to like work on. And so I'm right now kind of operating on the speculative thesis that we in Arizona, as a very purple state, would do very well to have a strong independent faction in politics. And that's not to say a party per se, but more of a faction, which is somewhat decentralized, isn't totalized by the idea of being a moderate, for instance. But okay, but how do you, I mean, there's so many ways for that to go wrong, and for that middle, that left right middle to get captured and get turned into a chess piece and all of that. So what do you do there? And I think the thing is that you kind of create, maybe you could say like a triangle or something, where you have the left right of governance, and then you have the base of the people, and then a independent faction exists in the middle of the whole triangle. And what I mean there is that it is distinctly not at least far left or far right. It is not beholden to party politics, in the sense that you can't have your left-right designation, Democrat, Republican, used as a weapon to disempower you, as happens today, because today you can be called a rhino, right? If you're not a real Republican, or you're just like a warmongering pseudo leftist or whatever, right? So not having that label and truly being independent, so to speak, is important. But then, okay, how do you bridge the divide between the high and the low here? And it makes me think that an effective independent faction has to be grounded to the people more strongly than the left and the right currently are. And so to me, that almost means, as a kind of campaign platform, that independent faction officials, candidates, or whatever, are explicitly and actually making themselves more available to that middle via more direct contact with constituents, more opportunities for kind of like what we're doing here, which is just having conversation, but publicly viewable conversation. So like kind of take the notion of like, the sense maker web, where people are just kind of getting together and hashing things out. But doing that about policy as elected officials with people that they disagree with, and so on. It's not a debate format. It's let's sit down at a table, let's have a discussion, and let's stream it so that the people can see us thinking in progress. So that's and probably having a more transparent and close relationship with reputable media sources, right? Who, I mean, that's its own kind of can of worms there. How do you make the media better? But let's say that there is an opportunity to have good media in that regard, which might be something like the kinds of people we find in the sense-making liminal web, but who are applying themselves to this specific purpose of helping to facilitate conversations among policymakers. Anyways, that's one thing I've been thinking about, and then the other thing I'll think of or talk it to is the kind of the shifting dynamics of the middle and the upper, and I see a lot of opportunities here, which kind of play into the patterns that y'all have just talked about. So we have the network now, and that could be a place of the middle, and it often is a place of the middle. But because the network is controlled by, technocrats or wannabe technocrats, well, then there's a pathway there for the middle to be captured. And it's just like you said, the lords of the network can say, hey, no, the government is the middle, right? And they're the ones who are ethically dominating us, and we need to overcome them. And then you have this massive concentration of power if they're successful in getting people on board with that battle. So it's like a move from, and I imagine if they do that, obviously they're going to do it under, I think the kind of superficial presentation of keeping the network as a middle, right? And you're going to have network states, and you're going to have these technocrats having their subscriber base vote on things like Elon Musk already does. I will, stay true to the outcome of this poll. Should I step down as CEO of Twitter, etc., and create a kind of an illusion of mediation there, which of course can be so easily just manipulated, distorted, just technically broken through artifice and deception. I mean, who's controlling the polls? Who's got the final say on all the back end basically of the. So I'll leave it there, but stuff.
That was magnificent. I'm extremely glad that you wandered in, because that's all perfect. There's many things that come to mind. So like the up, the middle, and the low, I think you described those dynamics very well. I also think of Leopard Coe's structure in The Breakdown of Nations, where he says we too often think in terms of left to right. We need to also think in terms of big to small. We have a very truncated kind of political science map by which to think about what's going on. I think also, like we've talked about before, like communities of sentiment, like there's all this talk about being independent or localism or going back to the smaller different things like that. The problem is that I've never met anyone who tells me that every time they vote Republican, everyone's apparently an independent. Like everyone all votes for the best candidate. It just happens to be the case that the best candidate is always their party, right? So one of the problems is everyone I meet is a moderate, right? Everyone is open to the best argument. It just happens to be that never, there's never an argument that doesn't align with their vision, as Thomas Sowell might say, right? With the constrained or the unconstrained vision. For that to occur, you need some sort of mechanism of regular exposure, or people like the sense maker, like the role of the sense maker, right? It does not seem as if it is actually genuinely possible for people to truly be, dare I say, independent, or really not captured ideologically, without some sort of space that can regularly expose them to a certain kind of conversation. We've spoken all the time about, like Jockin mentioning models, like you need a model of virtue, right? One of the virtues of these spaces is, like you say, this conversation is not for an audience and yet is. That's a really weird middle where you literally forget that you are creating content, which then creates the ability to actually see a more genuine, self-forgetful interaction that then can function as a model to people of what a kind of conversation can be like, right? And maybe only 20 people watch it. It doesn't matter. Like the more models of that you have, then you have a model of people of what it would look like to actually engage in a middle in a manner that it could actually bring people to the kind of consciousness that is not falling into ideological fractions, which almost always are going to reflect the high. Right, that's the problem. Like if you're ideological, you probably reflect the high. It's going to be very hard. Like one of the keys for Juvenal is that the middle had to have ideological distinction from the high. And the key way that was captured is between, well, the Pope and the King, the two swords of heaven and earth. That clearly showed a distinction. And the feudal lords had different ways of thinking about how things should be, or the chieftains, but then they became exploitative of the low, or the Pope got in bed with the church and all that felt. But when it was, without going through that history, there has to be a kind of ideological distinction between the middle and the upper. And that basically seems impossible without some sort of sense-making apparatus, right? But even if you have the sense-making apparatus, if it is cut off from cultural capital or places of influence because you don't have the certification or you don't meet the regulations, well, then the middle could easily just be functioning as an illusion of democracy that doesn't impact. And this is like, I think you have to break up, basically you have to redo certification. Basically, I think I talk about, colleges don't technically have a monopoly on credentials, but they kind of practically do. There are certain, like, you have to go to certain schools. Also, there are social pressures that if you go to a good university, it's expected for you to work for a big company, not to come back and do local policies, right? Also the pay to afford housing seems to reflect participating in the big, right? You also have various zoning laws. You have basically the way Ivan Illich was big on certification. I think we talked about this, like the certification. So this is what we have to think, because this is where, for me, the liminal web blurs with we have to think, what are the policies that are keeping the middle from being in competition with the upper? That's the key. What are those things? We're not saying outlaw the upper. We're not saying low people go burn down DC. What we're saying is give us a fair competition. You people all say you're capitalists. If you guys are really the best philosophers, thinkers, or culture makers out there, then let's just go. Like if you can go to school and get a certification better than something on YouTube, well then open the floodgates. Prove it. You don't need the law on your side, right? So this is where there is a very real policy matter here, that the liminal web, just having the sense making is necessary but not sufficient if you do not also think about the legal matters to open up a real competition that can then make a distinction of the middle. Because that's also important in juvenile. The middle can't exist if it doesn't exist in competition with the high. But then if the high controls the game, the board, there won't be a competition. It will actually just be a mechanism of capture. I think you're exactly right. Let me give it to Philip Jockin and then back to you, Christian.
I'm open-hearted with my skepticism. It's Markowitz's book that highlights the myth of meritocracy. Like what you just said, we need to go to Washington to, change the policies. Like maybe a tinge hyperbolic, but that's like literally everyone. Like it's so baked in that in order to address all the problems, in order to see all the solutions, would I think just take so many people having so much free time and dedicating themselves to these things outside of the university, which is happening and which is cool. And we may find a way to leverage technology so that you don't need as many people. And that can be that. I think that's very interesting. But Christopher P shared something with me the other day that was just like the amount of college students who graduate from quote unquote elite universities who find themselves unable to finish a book. Which like on some level, like I understand, because it could it could be the thing that sends them into like an existential wasteland, after which, they would find water, they'd be fine. But that initial like exodus, especially if you like have bought into everything that's needed to get into that type of school, it's much more protective of that subjectivity to not like do anything to push for a meritocracy. I think it's like one of the, I mean, I get I get pushed very, very far. Like I think you need to use less than 1% of your brain to earn a living. Less than one, maybe not even 0.1. I just think that's how it's set up. Like we've been sold a bill of goods. It's like, hey, in order for you to earn a living, you got to use half your brain, or maybe 3/4 of it. You got a little left for your spouse. If you think about your kids, great. What? Get a car, give them a phone at least. But a part of me is like, it's both a comment on the potential of the human brain, as well as how idiot proof they've made every job because they're counting on so many people to burn out so that like the turnover rates, like, what is this story of like one of the reasons Americans don't go on vacation is not that they'll like come back and there'll be a stack of papers on their desk and they'll be like, my God, now I got to catch up. It's that they'll come back and no one noticed they were gone. And they're like, wait a second, hold up. And so, like, I love this idea, Christian, that you're putting forward. And I do just feel like on some level it's got to be like a soup to nuts, the whole kit and caboodle type of revolution, so that people that are 8, 9, 10, 12 years old right now who are already in the digital swarm can find ways to access certain consciousness bandwidth so that they can follow a conversation like that. Right? Because I think if I put myself in the situation of a high, I don't know if the word is filibuster, but I would basically just grandstand the whole time. If the camera was on me and I didn't want shit to change, I would just use a bunch of big words and not stop talking. And just count on the demos not just being like, well, I'm not really sure what either of them said, but I guess you got to vote for one of them, and like knowing that the person that even speaks in plain language but has a 30-minute talk, like 8 seconds in, people just be like, kind of boring. Like, how do you get people interested in that kind of thing? I think, generally it's catastrophe. Like their life just has to go like off the rails. And they're like, oh, okay, what do I do? Either I like try and revise the law or I like do the whole lawlessness thing. Nevertheless, I think that is like an unbelievably cool idea, and I would tune in like 100% because I think that this is a step beyond, yet within the democratic voting system that is sorely missing. That is to say, the ability to see how we decide what and who we vote on, rather than just being presented with, red and blue person and being like, wait, like I get they have the DNC, the RNC, all that stuff, but it just seems sort of like more like political theater than actual representation of the people's desire. So I'll leave it there.
No, that's magnificent. And so there's a few things. I'll give it to Mr. Jockin and then Christian. First off, there is certainly something to be said about the devastation and the hell pushing people to be open to things they otherwise would not. And the question is, if the liminal web, or we'll say the sense-making space, or whatever language we want to use, the question is, can it position itself in a manner to actually benefit from the things going wrong, precisely because people are then open to things they otherwise would not be open to, that then if the liminal space is there modeling these alternatives, it's possible for people to see them and to thus move into them, right? And that makes me think of the, I always reference To Change the World by James Hunter, which is a remarkable sociological text asking what changes the world. And without going into detail, it has something to do with communities of faithful presence, or people in faithful presence to a work that then are there for people to see when everything goes to crap. And then people go, oh, And like, so for me also, you're right. There is a question. Well, everyone says to change the law. You're exactly right. So we have to be incredibly particular about the particular policies one would want to change. And I think studying jurisprudence, the ones that have a chance of working are the ones that both parties seem to benefit from according to their own internal logic. So for example, you say, hey, we need to open up certification so that more people have access to like alternative ways of life, housing, money, and so on and so forth. Republicans, you're always talking about competition. Aren't you about that? Democrats, you're always talking about democracy and escaping the elites. Wouldn't loosening certification requirements actually help both of you? Like, right? Oh, and they say, but we needed certification to make sure that we didn't have people who weren't any good going into it. Well, we have video. Let's watch. Let's see it. You know, we have the portfolio model now versus the resume model, right? The other thing too is you say, hey, we need, oh, by the way, because a lot of the things I'm interested in on a policy standpoint are things that are going to benefit from, say, what seems to be great problems that are coming down the pike. If you think AI is going to cause mass unemployment, then you need to radically democratize opportunities for employment or ways to connect with community, right? Well, the social coordination mechanism could do that, right? And the reason why people may be interested in it is because of the AI unemployment. So we're not saying legislation to stop AI. You're thinking about creating institutions that are positioned to be able to address a problem that is probably going to arise because of something that's coming down the pipe, right? So likewise, we talk about removing the classroom from in its medium, associating people with trivia, being an educated person, move it to an oral structure. What's happening with ChatGPT? It's making it really hard to know what essays and tests are going on. So the AI is helping all of the policy things that you're talking about that is opening up the real competition between the middle and the upper are also actually assisted by the technological shifts that are occurring that you can also position as benefiting both the ideology of the Republican and the ideology of the Democrat. So how could you possibly be against it? See, that is, I think, when you're being, dare I say, tactical or strategic about the particular policies that you're considering, because you're looking for a kind of impasse. You're looking for a kind of, hey, stuff's going to crap. It's pushing us in a new direction, and both of you would benefit according to your ideology by this policy change. That, of course, doesn't mean it would shift, but it, you can't force people to put it forth. But that's putting forth at least something that is positioned strategically based on the history of successful jurisprudence that would actually have a possibility that is also assisted, not in denial of the changes that are occurring. And you could also, frankly, then in this very mechanism, have better ways of creating ways of competition for a living that increase time energy. Oh, you think time energy is important? You know, there's a lot of people, though, that if you give time energy, they have to be home with their spouse and they don't know how to get along, so they actually don't want time energy, right? So that's another problem. So how do you coordinate ways to offer different ways of employment so people can have time energy in an order, in a way that they're ready for, that they may have to force themselves to get ready for as AI changes things, right? And so, and also, I think you're going to really need a social coordination mechanism as AI appears, because it's going to become increasingly difficult to tell what humans can do that AI cannot do. And so you need opportunities to train those capacities and to model and see those capacities and to interact with people that could help you think those capacities. But then, of course, to avoid, this is where I think I do make distinctions between the podcast ecosystem and the liminal web or the social coordination mechanism, because I think the podcast ecosystem does not necessarily help with this middle problem, more easy to be captured. This kind of thing is mixed together with an online, in-person, and also we're doing this because of friendship, as that net friends. Those are, so let me give it to Mr. Jockin and Christian. Mr. Jockin.
The first thing came to my mind was just on that point about the broadcast model versus liminal web. Yes, it's broadcast versus almost prompt generation interactions. Meaning, for example, I've been quiet just like I'm listening because what I'm doing is, because I come from a different mental model philosophically than the rest of this group. You know, I don't come from a Hegelian pick. Well, the basics, like my schema is much different. So a lot of what I was doing was listening and then kind of responding off the concepts brought up and then connecting it through the models of Aristotle, for example. I had notes about that. So in terms of like what's the purpose of the net or what this liminal web is meant to do, it's really interesting because what is happening there, I'm not coming in with a preset agenda, which is ironic, right? Because I just came in, I gave the opening remark, so I was the first one here, but then I was listening through and then responding, and then what's happening is I'm using this information from these different accounts and then binging it off my models, my reference points. I think that's kind of a big part of the idea of one, just the nature of the property of the middle, right? In terms of it's intellectual and digital assets have a very odd property where they generally have very asymmetrical distributions, as opposed to natural kind objects, generally much more normal distribution model. So one of the things we're almost addressing, almost like when kind of in response to noting saying that agriculture, every technology intervention has stressors on society that have to then be mediated through new intellectual or other developments. Agriculture, for example, gave us great food surplus, but guess what? Now we have to work way more, for example, and AKA becomes incredibly incentivized to get slavery, because why do the labor yourself when you can capture some other community, have them enslaved, and do the labor for you? You get all the benefits and then some. Or an example of the Industrial Revolution, that's the sedentary lifestyle gives us immense wealth. However, it's killing us. That's basically what we've concluded, right? From sedentary lifestyles, diabetes, obesity, things like that. It's almost like what we're seeing through with the liminal web or the internet web AI developments. We're seeing basically polarized assets, the extreme polarization of the middle, as we're seeing that developments we're discussing. And now we're addressing, hey, that's not a good thing. We need to make interventions to address those basically unanticipated outcomes, right? Those unanticipated results. Daniel, your comment about what is the demarcation of the middle against the high, or just if you're going to use that model or discussion about it, and it's very important because this idea of the middle is incredibly important for Aristotle. Obviously his entire doctrine of virtue is based on this mean, a golden mean, a reference of some kind. But also just in political ordering, this was the orientation, was this middle. Now, obviously, Aristotle had a very different reference of that middle because slavery did exist. And quite frankly, the sample of whom was going to participate is very different model-wise than what we normally interpret today. But nevertheless, he still places an importance to it. And in general, it's basically around some attribution of basically being a free scholar, a free citizen. That's usually his reference point. And this leads to an issue of attention and systems and time, right? Our relationship to it. Because generally one is the problem is our relationship, our time window of reference is very vastly different. I'm just saying that in the sense, for example, us being on the liminal web, having this interactive kind of free flow mode where we're not just broadcasting out a preset message, dumping it out to everybody, that means we have to have a certain kind of time window of reference, that we're not looking for an optimal result here and now for certain outcomes. There are other places where that is relevant. In this group, that's not what the relevant key is. And we're kind of using the space as creativity to kind of see what we respond to. But that's part of this community of practice. That's kind of the point. So this is aggregating a kind of cultivated, limited, small group that is that's basically coordinating through a community practice that we don't really know what the outcome yet is exactly, but it's getting produced out. We're seeing it through other modes. Basically, I know Dimitri and yourself, Daniel, giving talks. I did a book. I did a lecture series recently in Halcyon Guild. So we're seeing this output out in other platforms. I think actually now this is the close note on what was said at the very beginning, kind of synthesizing what I heard from everybody. Because Dan, you made the point about when I pointed out this issue of if we operate with a definitional attribution mode of the square is 4 parallel right angles. Well, guess what? If you have a conic polar mapping, you guys, I showed in the visuals, you got completely different things that do not look like triangles or squares, at all. Well, that leads to, and that you said that that's a question of who is this for. The other note is from Aristotle, it's called the statesis. It means search. It's a kind of state of mental operation where you're searching, you're put into a state of aporia. Because now what's happened is you kind of you've acknowledged and apprehended some phenomenon, and now you're trying to move on to the why, the connection to it, and especially when there's a violation of expectation. So when you're presented to, hey, guess what? You think a square is this, but it actually can be that. And by the definition, it meets all the requirements of it. What's happened is that's caused a rupture. And now you've entered into a state of kind of aporia, not even aporia, but now a state of zetesis, of search, where now you're trying to get at, wait a minute, what I thought was a fundamental necessity actually has some contingency underneath it that, as I hinted at, which is the fifth postulate requirement, to give us a new understanding possibility. I'm just saying that because what that means is the kind of, you said, Daniel, this idea of the operations, the conditionals to be met, the coordinations, the communication between experiences, right? And actually, Aristotle does talk about this, the idea that an essence of a thing is very qualitative in the sense that it is not a binary here is there and not is there necessarily, because, for example, like health in the human, it's the essential parts of a man that makes him healthy. You can have certain parts that are dysfunctional or breakage, but you're still a man and you're still considered healthy, for example. So that reminds me of that note from Aristotle about that. This idea of attribution seeing the halo. And also I bring this up because of a very, interesting point. I was looking this up while I was listening to everybody. It was in the Posterior Analytic, Book 1, Section 19. There's a section at the end about what happens when a subject and predicate are both stated. So when you're putting like basically the paradigm or the exemplar, when the subject is the predicate, what happens there? Aristotle has a very interesting note about. He basically, to kind of play off the note from Dimitri, a kind of infiniteness plays out. There's neither a primary nor ultimate subject when you do that, because now what's happened is either that subject now has an infinite amount of attributes, or the subject and attribute are infinite in number. We've basically blown up basically that object if we've done that. He said, however, there is one way. There is a way to apprehend it. Is they can be reciprocated by different modes. An accidental predication in one, essential predication in the other. That's analogy. That's the kind of mode of it. I think that's a really interesting note. And by the way, I'm bringing this up is that I only came to that. I'm bringing this up just to say that insight only came from hearing from Dimitri and you talking, and then going, wait a minute, I've heard this somewhere. And specifically on this property of zetesis coming up, this idea of search. So what happens is when there's a kind of blowing up that occurs, a kind of aporia kind of explosion, where you're like, wait a minute, now all these attributions don't make any sense. Like this way of connecting doesn't have any apprehension to me. You have to go through a search and come to a deeper understanding, which is an analogos, which gives you a connection. Because even the concept of especially activities, not even functions, because usually what is this for usually attached to a function, but more generally to activities, even terms we take for granted, like falling, like a chair falling, a table, a pen falling, and a person falling are actually very different. Their operations of the activity are very different, yet that activity of to fall, the verbiage, to fall, is an activity in time that has a connection. There's an activity, there's a connection to all these discrete phenomenon. Now it connect together by some abstraction. As a real reality, an ageia, that connects to all those phenomena that are supposedly very different. Anyways, these are just great points. And then just the closing note on the political side of coordination and activity, I do think that's actually really important in the sense of, I think ultimately the kind of attention seems to be the marker. That seems to be a really important thing I'm seeing. And I say this because on two notes. Ironically, through digital operations, AI, things like being a technician actually has become very important. Being material on the ground, a plumber, electrician, actually is incredible. They're getting salaries far actually equal to professors and all things. It's hilarious. Now they don't have the social honoring that those income, that honor and social capital aspect of it, but from a raw economic value transaction point of view, it's actually more valuable. But the other side, and I was talking to a colleague of mine in education, is when we have things like MOOCs and video apparatuses, there's the problem, or like what is the value of the in-person educational experience? And I think that actually a big, I was discussing with a colleague, it is the acting on direct action, that actually that attention and cognitional efforts to take knowledge and convert it into activity, to develop things and to be accountable, and consistency of execution has ironically become a virtue of higher and higher importance. So what I mean by that is there's huge swaths of information, huge swaths of things you could do, but the actual commitment to say, I'm going to show up every Thursday at 3 p.m. to do X for this duration, and we're going to consistently evaluate and move forward based on that. That's actually, ironically, in this state, it's actually become a very important virtue, that kind of almost fortitudinal commitment, because it actually grounds real demand of almost, what shall I say, not even necessity, but it kind of does. It kind of gives a concreteness to this and kind of infinite abstraction in a lot of ways. So it becomes, I find that it has the main attribute that actually has worked out, because information is available widely. AI can do a bunch of stuff, but the actual commitment of execution, both on craftsmen and technicians, but also people just doing the activity of showing up every day or showing up a certain time to do a certain activity, has become exponentially more and more an important distinction mark of people. Because basically getting washed away in basically procrastination is a very common problem. And I yield. That's all I got.
Fantastic. That's exactly right. So, and basically, in my opinion, without that commitment, you can't have a boundless will. You're going to have a will to the boundless that leads to pathology. Also, too, the key is the consistency of showing up every Thursday at 3 is like the consistency of a stable system, but it's in the actual. Thus, it brings necessity together with contingency, and thus creates the effective freedom and spirit that's positive, as Dimitri was pointing as. Whereas if you seek the consistency of saying all the dots in my worldview are connected, it all holds together, then it's not brought into the concrete. So it's an abstraction that leads to abstract freedom that leads to pathologies. But you say, if I am in my contingency going to choose a necessity. That basically for Hegel is the only place that absolute spirit can show up. Or, beauty, dang it. Like that, it's only in that. And then I would argue that history shows that with the notion of faithful presence. And it's just been just what Hunter points out is it really matters where you do your regular commitment. And in history, it tends to be close to places of social, political, and economic power. Like you're meeting at Bloomsburg near Cambridge, or you're meeting in these like Scottish, like near something, right? The key is now, what I would argue is that Hunter and Collins and all these people, their structure, what they are talking about is no longer, because of this technology, geographically bound, actually, which of course would be necessary in a globalized, globally connected world. I think Michelle Bowens is correct when he says that he talks about local dynamics at a global scale are now possible or could be possible. Well, if we take that to the history of cultural influence, well, then that would mean the stuff that Hunter's talking about, or Collins, could be done, but it's not possible, though, through mere content creation. That's something they all stress. No, it's through a commitment to a regularity, thus making a necessity out of the contingency. That then the reason why that's necessary is because it's the only way to do the thing you were just saying, Jockin, on the models. You've talked about like models smashing together, Hegel and Aristotle, and new kind of analogous connections coming together. All of that is the halo of like the halo effect, which you can only do by an active participation. It is also the only way to make possible the epistemology of overlap that Deleuze talks about. So Deleuze had this idea that what we need to do, okay, he's against epistemologies of representation, right? Because representation is totalitarian and neurotic or whatever. All right, well, what we need to do is take Hegel, overlap it with Aristotle, and see where they overlap. Like bring them over one another, and then you'll see connections. Deleuze is big on these connections, these creative connections. Connection is not representation. That allows new emergences and new thoughts and new relationships that otherwise would not occur. Here's the problem. Like I was saying with Cadell, Deleuze's thought, in a way, did not have the technology where we did not have the technology for costly Deleuze, only cheap Deleuze. So there's a way in which Deleuze was too soon. Because the only way you can do that overlap thing, like colleges can't do it, because here's the problem. How, in order to overlap Aristotle and Hegel, you would have to be a world expert in both Hegel and Aristotle. You don't have the time energy for that. How's that even possible? Okay, then you need to get a Hegelian scholar and Aristotelian in the same room. But what are they going to talk? They don't know what to talk about to overlap. Because if they did, they would have already done it. There's only one way. A regular experimentation of people committed to the same space coming together, not knowing what's going to come up, which then there's the possibility of overlaps that surprise you. That is only possible in a liminal structure like this. This is not possible in a university system, even if you say, let's have an inter-philosophical dialogue between Hegelians and Aristotelians, and it's going to be Thursday at 3. Is it going to be every Thursday at 3? Are people going to drive there? Are they going to have the money, the time, energy? No, we're going to do it one Thursday. The probability of that single Thursday finding all the Deleuzian overlaps between Aristotle, Hegel, let alone Plato, Heidegger, and everyone else in economics is like zero. It's not going to happen. So it's just not practical. So if you want to have the Deleuzian epistemology that is not prone to fall into the problems that postmodernism rightly deconstructed, there wasn't the technology for that kind of epistemology. Now there is the overlap epistemology, where you see where things overlap, and the key to that is overlap is not equal sign, because if you make it, because Hegel and Aristotle are different, right? You can't make them equal without losing them. Well, then how do you have them relate without them fighting, right? Well, you have to have them overlap almost by chance. Because if it's intentional, people can be too libidinally invested in their specialty and things collapse, right? So you have to have that commitment to a regularity where models can overlap, analogy can occur, then there's the halo and synchronicity, that's correct. And then all of that is precisely the attribute that unveils the halo. We were saying at the beginning that what is the attribute that breaks everything open, right? The attribute of the faithful presence communities, the liminal webs, the attribute that breaks everything open is that magical overlap that unveils the analogous judgment that shows that there's a possibility of a relationativity that creates connectivity, and then you feel like you've created something together, and people who create together feel relationally close together. There's something about creativity and friendship that goes together, all of which then makes you go, my gosh, there's a lot more to the philosophy humanities than I thought. I didn't know. I thought it was over. I thought we got rid of it with Richard Rorty neo-pragmatism. It's almost like it's almost like it didn't, it's almost like it hasn't even started. Suddenly philosophy feels like it hasn't even started. How did that happen? It's the Nabokov painting. You've seen it, now you can't unsee it. And now you know that it hasn't even started because of these overlaps that are possible because of the social coordination system, and you must change your life. You cannot go back to not knowing it. Now you know it's possible. So then the question is simply, will you continue to be committed to it or not? Will you continue to make that absolute choice or not and continue to do the work out of it, which is precisely the move into a boundless will versus a will to the boundless. And I think you put that all very well. Basically you can't, and I'll give it to Christian and Philip, and then I should go to work, but you people are wonderful and work sucks. Basically, you cannot have pluralism until you have model pluralism. Like, you can't. Until you have overlaps and the structures like you were saying, Jockin, there is no pluralism. Pluralism is model pluralism, or it's simply how people look, right? Like, if it's not view or deep or essence or exchange, then it's not pluralism. But how do you have different views of the world exchange with one another and it feel intimate? The overlap creates the intimacy. Otherwise, it's just Christian says how he sees world, Hindu says how he sees world. We talk about ways we can get along, and then we leave and go back. Okay, there's not going to be friendship. If you want to have model pluralism that creates friendship and creativity and all that, you need overlap epistemology per se, as Deleuze would put it, which is going to tie into analogy and all that. And I do have critiques for the end of difference and repetition on the analogy of representation, the epistemology of the representation. But without going into all that, because I think the later Deleuze is aware, he's quite radically unique. But in order to have the overlap epistemology, you need, like you say, that fidelity to a consistent place. Because in a world that is full to the brim with information, the value is in the overlap. Information does not give you the overlaps of the model, right? Like, information does not give you the overlaps of the information. That's the human stewarding. I'm not going to say that AI will never be able to do that. I don't know enough about AI. But there is at the very least a distinction between overlap and information, right? Like, humans have the ability to fold the information over itself, to see the overlaps that create new analogies and new connections that aren't there. And that feels like an intimate act. So if you want to have pluralism, have this friendship and intimacy to it, it requires, Mr. Jockin, please.
I'm sorry just to jump back. I forgot to put a note in because I had to think about, I had the word real. So what you're talking about, you and Dimitri, I had the word realization, to realize, and the idea of relevant realization. So a lot of I was talking about this last net. I just want to jump in and point out, like, the interfacing of the relevance realization to a particular context. That is the tension that is basically, that's not computational, because that's the point. At what context domain do you strike through? Like, how can I possibly recall? Oh yeah, a posterior analytic. I'm going to look into that from a response from Dimitri about the good and bad infinite. Like the fuck, like what AI could possibly say? And by the way, I did not fully know. I actually had to go. I had a hunch of a memory. That's the thing, because the epistemology of the human subject, by the interfacing of our body, our memory, which is a physical bodily entity, the power of the estimation, which is of biological nature. Animals have that too. Plus syllogism, apprehension, and judgment. Like it's the interfacing. Oh, by the way, with an imagination, which is the phantasms which are operating on us, we operate on and operate on us at the same time, with emotional, thematic response, interacting with all that, and the interaction of the boesis, the will. Oh, and by the way, the good, and beauty interacting on us. Anyway, so the point is like those interfering models or confounding factors led to me to come to a hypothesis nudge that hey, I think there might be something interesting in posterior analytic, book 1, section 19, on basically search, basically on the operational search, and then led to this, and then seeing from there. Oh, by the way, also, and then we had this really fun mode of analogy, basically being represented by to address that aphoric response. Anyways, my point is like AI, like Vervaeke and company have standard. They're spending really hard on that research to say, no, AI cannot. That's not computational. That's categorical. Like it's category shifting and making very nuanced decision weighing to say no. We think that's a high, that probability is worth exploitation investigation. Anyways, just want to add that note in.
No, I think that's brilliant. And basically, I like the emphasis there on realization, because to make real is requiring, it takes this Deleuzian overlap epistemology, connection, realize, and everything feels most real, and the relationship feels most real, and the friendship in the community feels most real. And the point, the notion feels relevant. That's like you're saying there, like when things overlap, you say, oh my gosh, there's a connection between Aristotle and Hegel. Boom, it has an automatic relevance realization that then makes the interaction feel real. This feels like real philosophy, relevant philosophy versus the boring academic philosophy where you're like, why am I here? So there's something about that overlap and the realization that are very powerful, and the making real that can come from overlap seems distinct from the reality of information, even if the overlap realization is only possible because of the information, like as a prerequisite. You have to have that kind of thing. And I think, yes, there's something about, that the human black box, that memory, so you have awareness, you were saying is important, awareness or attention with Illich and Vey and McGilchrist put together. So there's an attention, then there's a memory and an intuition, and then, oh, right, Aristotle, bam. So there's these things that come together. That's almost the human black box, that the better we get at that seems to be our kind of competitive edge, if you will, against the AI. Now, maybe again, I don't know, Thomas Helmer, if AI, general intelligence, again, but like that particular black box seems to be what it means to cultivate the kind of, like we're saying, the kind of consciousness that is able to be toward the world in a manner that has a boundless will versus a will to the boundless, right? And then all of that, and the ability to take a leap of faith versus leap for some neurotic father, big other, or different things. I'll also know quickly before I forget, and I'll give it to Christian and Philip, I think it becomes easier and easier with time, though, in history, it may become easier to make the mistake of willing for the boundless, precisely because the longer history goes on, there's the more things you can do. It feels like boundless is possible, right? Like now you can fly it, you can have more experiences, you can read all the books, you can go anywhere. So it seems like the movement of history may bring with it, as it increases our very possibility, it also thus perhaps makes the mistake of the will for the boundless easier to make, precisely in giving us more experiences. The great sweet spot seems to be, as you get more experiences that make it seem like the boundless is possible, in light of that, you nevertheless make the absolute choice for a particular thing, which then, because it was possible for you to do all these boundless things, makes that absolute choice all the more powerful and non-rational, ergo beautiful and intimate. The very fact that you could be doing like anything, and the fact that you on every Thursday at 3 are here, thus makes it more intimate, right? So the increase of the temptation to love humanity or to will the boundless seems to have in its very contradiction, if you will, a certain kind of making more powerful the boundless will, or a certain kind of capacity is given to it. But it is done so in the temptation, in greater temptation. Like that's a religious notion. The greater the temptation, the greater the virtue if you resist it. Right? That's kind of a theological history, right? Well, likewise, the greater the temptation for the will for the boundless, the greater the power of the boundless will. Let me hand you. Oh, I love you. That's hilarious, Christian. I love that. But let me give it to you and then Philip. Christian, please.
Well, yeah, we already had the Christian perspective, so now we need the Hindu perspective. I'm gonna keep my video off because my connection's not great. First of all, on this whole topic of a commitment to engagement and coming together, thank you, Daniel, for the work that you do in your own commitments there. I appreciate it quite a bit. So, and also, you guys are terrible because you bring up too many interesting topics of conversation. It's like a buffet. I feel like I'm at like Willy Wonka's philosophy factory or something. I'm gonna gorge myself. I've got notes and that helps. Yeah, with the AI thing, I think that the body affords us intelligence, and consciousness affords us intelligence. Relevance realization and non-dual realization might just be out of the domain of synthetic AI or AI. Also, it's a funny point that you brought up, and it's true, Thomas, about how contractors are making as much as like academics and stuff. That's true with my friends here in a rural area. $40-50 an hour for kind of like basic labor, just because there's a demand for it and people have to pay it. And now I'm finally competing with my friends as an independent journalist. I was surprised by how much I could make for working now for a small Arizona independent newsletter. I was like, holy smokes, I can afford a new car. I can do all sorts of stuff. But okay, so some interesting points. The agriculture as an incentive to slavery and commodifying humans. I'm worried about that happening with sense making as well. And I think it's one of the reasons why I've gained a little bit of a controversial reputation in certain corners of the liminal web, is because I'm very vigilant about the dynamics of that I'm worried about there, and I speak to them, and a lot of times people don't like that. But basically, I think in the sense making space, you have certain hazards, like you have truthiness, which just like truth can get lost in abstraction and just like overwhelm. You also can have meaninglessness, where you're saying a bunch of stuff, but it's just not really holding any water. It's not doing much for anyone. You have the classic, the tyranny of structurelessness, and then I think you have that kind of power hierarchies disguised or getting snuck into like systemic hierarchies, and you've got like modernism kind of like sneaking its way into meta-modernism via blue, teal, whatever, all that kind of shit. So then back to the political thing. I agree with you, Philip. I have a lot of my hope rests in the younger generation, because I'm still you have to work with what you've got and play the hand you're dealt the best you can. But I'm like, how can I hand off my hands to the younger folks? Thinking at least a few steps ahead there, and that's super important. And one of the biggest obstacles I find with people my age, I'll turn 40 next year, is a commitment to participation in anything to do with policy. Is really tough, because I think people basically have like political PTSD. Fortunately, I do have a strong community, but as Daniel gave me language for it, it's a task-oriented community, rather than a ideologically oriented community or economically oriented. Well, at least not in the sense of like capitalist oriented. And that's tough, but I'm still trying to do work there. And then you also because that's tough work, you also have these traps of, well, I can just kind of hang out in the abstraction of sense making as kind of a form of escapism, basically. But you can also get stuck in localism. Well, I'm just going to keep my head down and, till my field, and I'm not even looking at the horizon because guess what? Someone's going to want my field. But I don't want to worry about that because that means I have to get involved with politics, and that's just like too messy, and I hate it, and there's so much culture war and all of that. So it's a really tricky spot. And in general, I'm kind of like, I've been thinking about this the last few days. There's so much energy, I feel like, in the world right now, in culture. And it's like, how do you respond to it without escaping or trying to win the game or something like this? And it's a hard work to not try to deny that energy, but also not try to somehow believe you can stop it or something. It's like, how do we like ride the waves, or how do we harness that energy and keep our wits about us and keep a sense of inner peace and do something effective with all of it? It's tough, but one kind of hopeful note I'll make, at least it's just based on my experiences. I don't know how scalable it is or cross applicable it is, but to your point, I think you're right, Philip, that the problems with like addressing the what we see in politics and bureaucracy and everything else in these power dynamics is tough because you can't use the typical. I mean, I'm not going to organize a college protest for sense making. That's just probably not going to happen. Nor am I going to create the sense making institute that's going to like win the capitalism game and use power to fund itself. But I think the bright side is that I think we can do a lot with a little. I don't think we need as much. If we do it smart, a little bit can go quite a long way. And I'll give two examples there. And of course, the context here is that I live in a rural area, but one of our population centers, Bisbee, Arizona, which I think is like 9,000 people or something. The city council and mayor were about to push for a ban on shipping containers on their property for storage and whatnot. And it was like, that sucks. We just should not prohibit that. And they were just like, oh, well, it's ugly and it lowers property values. And it's like, well, that's stupid. All I did was I went on Facebook to the Bisbee community groups, and I didn't even make a big speech. I just said, hey, this is what Bisbee's doing. Isn't that kind of silly? And there was an overwhelming, I mean, not a single person supported the idea. Like 50 people were like against it. And in a small area, even the mayor of Bisbee engages on Facebook, and they dropped it. They're like, oh, never mind. I guess this is not something we're going to do. And all I did was make a Facebook post. At the state level, the strategy I'm thinking is like, and it's a little unique here because we are a very purple state, very slim margins of power. But because it's such a divided state, all it would take is a very slim minority of true independent policymakers to have an incredible amount of power, because they basically control what gets a majority vote, right? And so then both parties can no longer play this game of we just need to flip it this way or that way, and we're all going to vote for each other's bills, because if you don't vote for my bill, I'm not going to vote for your bill, and we're a team, and all this. Like, it's a really shitty dynamic that just gets wedged deeper and deeper. But it only takes a small minority to take away that dynamic. Like 2 or 3% of the policymakers would have like basically policy making power, and then that can be leveraged to make sure that their policies get a shot, that they get their bills get hearings, that they get put on the committees they want to get put on, and stuff like that. So I see that it doesn't necessarily take as some kind of like huge political campaign or like grassroots parties creation to actually effectively wield a lot of power in government. At least that's my working theory. But that's it then. Yeah, and thanks again, Daniel. I appreciate it. And thank you, Philip. This is such productive conversation for me.
You rock, Christian. I appreciate it very much. You said so much there that was just outstanding. I'll give it to Philip and then run. It is very interesting. Like right now, even on like that point you made on actually little small things can be done that can influence power, there's a real sense in which we actually even see this on the national stage right now, right? There's like what, 5 swing states that are going to decide everything, and you could argue like what, 15 counties? Like, it's actually a really small amount of area that determines the fate of the massive power, right? And I wonder by that a lot, because I actually think like little examples like breaking up or opening competition in terms of credentials, I think that's a little small change that's unsexy and therefore might be able to avoid the vitriol of the culture war dynamics that actually from there has massive impacts on the whole system. I think part of the being smart is saying, what are the little things in policy that are kind of beneath, you know, the surface that people are noticing that if you changed would not, because you can't go in saying would make everyone think like me. We need to open up competition in a sense, right? This is where the conservatives or the free market people like competition is right. Yeah, let's open up competition between means that may give you less money but more time energy with ones that give you more money but less time energy. Let's see which one's better for human beings, right? You know, like that kind of competition, not merely competition between the corporations to see who gets the most money, but competition between different ways of being human. And that's all we're asking. That's all we're doing. You people over there, you do whatever you like. If you love the way you're living without time energy, great. But let's make the little shifts that are unsexy to open the playing field of different models. Because when I say competition too, I don't mean competition in the sense where the liminal web goes to war with the universities. It's shine competition, model competition. We're just going to model a different way of doing it, put it in the public sphere where everyone can see it. You can see and then you choose, right? Like this isn't competition in the sense of how do we beat the universities. It's beauty competition. It's shine competition. But you couldn't do shine competition until you had a freaking liminal web space that could show effectively with the infrastructure of video and content, the alternatives, right? There was a kind of monopoly on who got to shine and who didn't, right? So shine competition, if you grant me that, was not a model competition, show competition, was not really a realistic means of competition until you've gotten new technological advancements. Most model competitions has been on the low, the individuals. You encountered a man or a woman or a model or an elder and you wanted to be like them, right? But entire different modes of social engagement, that was very difficult to see because you couldn't travel around the world or you were born in a certain town, right? To be able to see different models of way to carry yourself in the world, that is the silver lining of this new technology that we have. That allows a more effective social coordination, that allows a model competition, and simply what policies can we change? What little things can we shift to open up the effectiveness of that model competition so that all modes and models have equal access or equal opportunity for the capital, for the money, for the political sway. We don't want equality of outcome. No. So, no, we're not saying give everyone. Let's just have an equality of opportunity, an equality of competition for capital and money and all of these different things that becomes possible with model competition, right? Conservatives say all the time they want, equal opportunity, just not equal outcome. Great. That's what we'll do. Here's all the models. Here's all the different ways of being, and just remove the regulations on certification and access. That means the only way you get that stuff is if you go through the capital nation state that then removes the capacity to have an alternative mode of consciousness, right? Let the games begin, right? That becomes, I think, a small shift that actually has massive consequences. And I think the other point you just made, I do think you can, the thing is, if you get on the internet or Facebook and say, we need to outlaw abortion or make abortion good. Well, you're not going to do it. But if you get online and say, we're going to remove cargo, hey, they're going to pass a law for cargo carriages, that's unsexy. No, that can actually do something. So using the platforms for things like that, that's also being strategic. That's also being smart. But if you use a platform to say Goldman Sachs is evil, what are you going to do, right? But actually this was the point. Unfortunately, and I think this goes to what you're saying with the sense-making being a problem, the likelihood that of the little things happening in your community that you could use your online platform to change, like the cargo, like the storage sheds, is extremely low if you don't what? Go out into your community and interact with the local people and see what's going on. You have to go, but if you do go out, then you can concretely see, oh, that's a thing, and then use the platform for that thing. But that's where if you just stay on the sense making and you're talking about higher consciousness, however valid that might be, you don't experience the lived community to see the things that actually you could use the platform to change. So you're going to be using all of that sense-making capital toward large, like big targets that aren't going to shift, right? Even if you're right about them, you have to go you have to go and see those things. Like you have to go see how the truck driver lives and sees how regulation actually works against them, those kind of things. So that's the problem. Like the thing, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you, the online spaces, it's like, we can't have any political difference. Well, not if you stay on the online space. You're never going to see the little things that you could actually have a political difference in, right? So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. But then the problem, of course, is a lot of the sense maker people struggle to find a way to interact with the blue collar or truck driver. So then they struggle to go into the spaces where they can see the small things that can shift. And so then yeah, nothing freaking happens. So I love that example. Philip, you're great. Philip.
I'll be quick. I think that this has lit my imagination on fire, because I think also there is someone who could go into Goldman, BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, talk to those people as well, just to understand what they're going through. They're often caricatured, and find ways of maybe just making friends and increasing the ability of our impactful activity, even in spheres that may seem untouchable. But I want to ask you real quick. Actually, I think it's an imminent life. Deleuze talks about your boy, David Hume. And I'm just wondering if you can, real quick, because I know you got to go, low, middle, high, his idea of common life.
Outstanding, and I completely agree. I think it is extremely important for sense-making people to interact with people who are in the banking, who are in the corporations, who are in governments. One of the things with people in government, and one of the things is how they actually feel powerless, just like the people do. Like whatever they want to do, they can't do anything because of the Congress or the law or different. It's actually pretty wild how powerless everyone feels. It's a Big Brother kind of Brazil movie thing. Now, not always but it's really wild.
But I do have friends in finance who, although they do feel powerless, they're making deals left, right, and center. That is making sense to them, at least in a personal buffer against everything falling apart. They're like, dude, I have 30 rental properties. We're gonna buy Christian's land. They're like, yeah, no, I actually can figure that out. But if I'm like, hey, how do you feel about Dasein, or something like this? They're just like, dude, I would never think of that. I'll do that when I'm retired, And by the time they get there, they've turned into the undead, right?
Yep.
And they're sort of shells of who they once were, and staring at what will be someone's giant inheritance.
I don't disagree with all of that. One of the great ironies is that powerlessness tends to lead to over-identification in order to hide yourself from the powerlessness. That's a kind of you say, okay, I feel powerless, but hey, I've got a personal buffer. Hey, I'm powerless, but I control all these people at the small business. Hey, I'm powerless, but my family does everything I say. There's a way in which the response to powerlessness is the reestablishment of a neurotic, or to become a psychotic in that powerlessness where you still have the power to enclose yourself in your own psychotic structure, but then you become unintelligible to everyone. So I think you're exactly right. But what's interesting is the way that people who have power feel powerless, and then how to speak to that requires, like you're saying, getting to know them and actually to kind of have, but that's surgery. That's like psychological, philosophical surgery in a way, to be able to play that kind of particular game that you're not going to be able to do for a particular person if you love humanity at the expense of individuals, as frickin' Dostoevsky's saying, if you're unwilling to go into Goldman Sachs because you're better than them, and if you don't have the street smarts to figure out how to speak with them so they don't not want to talk to you, right? And that gets into the street smarts. Christian also had a wonderful comment about the danger of a theory and the conspiracy. That's exactly right. That is the danger. Map is indestructible. Constant communication, like constant community, encounter, and surprise, they all go together. I loved all of it. The thing I would say to close, before I do have to run, because Jockin made this wonderful point, I think it just ties into this about the searching, how spaces like this make this ability of kind of searching, to kind of encounter, overlap, surprise. That's where the halo, all of those things, right? In my opinion, there is no possibility of being an actual moderate or independent politically unless you're engaged in searching. Like when people say they're moderate, what the heck does that mean? I went through my political views and I have 50% Republican and 50% Democrat, therefore I'm moderate. That is, what does it mean to be a moderate? Or when you say I'm an independent, that means what? You don't have a single view that has been formed by an ideology, or you don't identify with it. What do you mean by independent? Mostly they say I'm an independent because I might vote Democrat or I might vote Republican. Okay, well, you're just bi-dependent then. You're not independent, you're just bi-dependent. Okay, to be independent, you would require searching. But how the heck do you do that? You have to have an infrastructure that allows this constant interaction. There is no possibility of actual moderation or independence without a space like this, in my opinion. Like, because you can't have a regular habit or mode of training yourself into the kind of searching. So you have to have a space that makes that possible. And basically, again, the whole idea of democracy working is that people are actually independent thinkers, right? Well, we all know that's been not so well met, because Tocqueville says when we actually tried it, people immediately went back to identifying with a neurotic structure because it's too terrifying to be independent. It's too terrifying to actually be open to the best argument. It's too terrifying because you'd have to change your life. And then once you experience the best argument, you can't unexperience it, which goes back to what we said at the beginning. So people have not generally wanted to be independent because it would demand too much. They may have to change everything, right? But what if there was a middle, a social space where you could regularly, gradually come to terms with the new, with the independent in a manner that you could handle, versus see something and then be left to handle it on your own, right? To have that kind of constant Beatrice exposure with the sun so that you can handle it, right? Like in order to actually have independence, you require an infrastructure of the overlap, of the analog, of the surprise, and different things like that. And that is exactly what David Hume is getting at with common life. You must have a common life where overlap can occur, because the example I always give for that, David Hume says is does not equal ought, because he's trying to tell you that the only way to get to ought is from suchness, the such particular experience. If you have a definition of a cat, you say cats are furry with tails and they ought to eat food, or they ought to climb trees, and then you encounter the cat in your neighborhood that's missing a leg, so that cat ought to not climb a tree. So his point is that ought is found in suchness, not isness, right? Without a middle, you get a world that's ethics and politics is based on is to ought, not suchness to ought, okay? And once that occurs, you have tyranny, right? But the only way to then what suchness is the surprise and encounter of a particular cat that overlaps with your idea, but doesn't equal your idea, right? But the problem is the space that has made common life possible in history to not fall into tyranny has also been what has oppressed people and caused tyranny in terms of racism, xenophobia, and so on and so forth, right? Okay, well then if you're going to get back the middle without being an ethical regression, you need a new kind of common life. A structure of in common. What can we find is in common with our ideas, with what actually is? What can we find in common between Aristotle and Hegel? What can we find in common between one another that can overlap? Well, this is what this space can occur. A common life as a variable in David Hume isn't reducible simply to a farmhouse or something. The point of the common life is the shock of difference, the break between is and ought. He broke is and ought to make space for common life. He broke apart is and ought for suchness. But suchness is a surprise, and it is an overlap. And for David Hume, without that, the basis of your ought will be an isness that will prove tyrannical. And that's what has occurred. It's become total. It's become the high without the middle, right? So by bringing back a common life makes possible to have an in common life, which is when you found connections and analogs and overlaps you did not know was there, without which you can't realize anything. You can't make anything real, so then you have nihilism and a meaning crisis, right? Meaning crisis is what reflects a world that doesn't feel like it can make anything freaking real. Well, yeah, real is a feeling of overlap. Real is a feeling of surprise as encounter. You don't ask if the external world is there when it shocks you and when it surprises you and when it makes something appear to you that you've never thought before. When the world brings something before you that you never thought, you're like, yes, I guess the world actually exists. It's there, and it's capable of creativity that I can't just find in my own head. The effectiveness of that experience and the probability of that experience, though, is very low without other people. So you need other people that will encounter, that will surprise you, but you need those other people to have also made their own absolute choice to bring the reservoirs of their readings and their experiences and then have the ability to share them and be not afraid to make possible that in common life, without which it only makes sense that you would fall into a meaning crisis. But that is only possible with a commitment to a common space that you're regularly meeting at, which generates a common life where overlap, creativity, and surprise is possible, that does open up new horizons of social coordination, new ways of carrying ourselves in the world, and I do think there's hope in that. We just have to keep to the work. Gentlemen, it's been a pleasure.